Welcome to Lawline with your host, Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman is a distinguished trial attorney, author, and lecturer. Each week, Lawline will bring you the most knowledgeable experts in the field of law today. And now we introduce our guest and our host, Alan Schnorman.
Welcome to Lawline. How will New York's fiscal crisis affect the ability of the court system to handle the ever-increasing crime rate? What will be the repercussions of the plans to build new courtrooms, have speedier trials? These are just some of the issues we'll be looking at with our guest, Matthew Crossan, Chief Administrator of the New York State Court System. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Alan. Glad to be here.
Matt, as Chief Administrator of the court system, what do you do? What are your job duties?
Well, under the Constitution, I'm responsible on behalf of the Chief Judge for the entire operation and administration of all the courts in the state, which is a general way of putting it. On a day-to-day basis, I have to oversee the administrative side of everything that happens in the court system. Of course, the adjudicative side, what happens in the courtroom itself, is entirely up to all of the judges in the state.
Well, how many judges are there? How many employees do you supervise?
There are about 1,200 judges. There are about 2,300 town and village justices in the town and village courts around New York. And we have about 14,000 non-judicial employees.
You can't help but reading, every time you pick up a newspaper, you hear about budgetary cuts. You were quoted in the New York Law Journal recently that says we're on the edge of a disaster. What do you mean by that?
Well, it wasn't really hyperbole. We are very close to a disaster. The workload increases in the courts in New York State during the last 5 years have been enormous. People are familiar with what's gone on in the drug crisis generally, but the impact on the court system has been unprecedented, unlike anything we've ever experienced before. Criminal courts in New York City, for example, have experienced a 75% increase in indictments in 5 years. Prior to that, an increase in indictment from 1 year to the next of 2 or 3% was customary. Now we've had 75% more indictments in 1990 than we had in 1985, and yet the number of judges handling those indictments has increased only 9%. 9% increase in judges to handle a 75% workload increase. The family court in New York City also is suffering terribly as a result of the drug crisis. They've had a 55% workload increase. Now we're even beginning to see the impact of the state's fiscal situation in civil courts. In the last 2 years alone, civil courts throughout the state have had a 23% increase in their workload. Now, we don't have the resources to deal with that kind of workload increase, and the only thing that happens is that the services that the courts are able to provide declines gradually, bit by bit, year to year. And when the services of the courts are able to provide declines, then, which of course is the administration of justice itself, that has inevitably has a disastrous effect on the streets in New York.
Well, if you had a crystal ball in front of you, the governor's talking about further cuts.
Well, the governor's talking about further cuts, but we're not. We submitted a budget to the legislature about a week and a half ago for next year, for the fiscal year that begins on April 1st, that calls for an increase. Now, it is not nearly as much of an increase as we need. It's not as much of an increase as the courts themselves asked for, but it is an increase at a time when other parts of state government are seeking decreases. We don't have a choice, though. We have made the point to the governor that one of the fundamental basic functions of government is the administration of justice. You don't cut back on the administration of justice. You cut back on other things first before you cut back on the courts. The courts are operating very close to the brink and have been for the last few years, and it would be irresponsible for us to seek a decrease. We are seeking an increase. We can't give it to ourselves. We have to rely on the governor and the legislature to do that. But if we don't ask for it, we're not going to get it. And if we don't ask for it, we're being irresponsible, so we're asking for it.
Well, what's going to happen if you don't get it?
Well, if we don't get it, I think we will begin to see the shift of resources even more from courts of civil jurisdiction to criminal courts and family courts, because we have to keep the criminal courts and family courts operating.
You're telling closing parts?
That can mean closing parts, not only in New York City, but throughout the rest of the state. The reason is very simple. The number of employees that we have available begins to decline. We have to shift employees to the criminal and family court parts. We don't really have a choice. Overall, what will happen, and this is something that people don't really understand very well, in criminal courts, what will happen is there will be more and more plea bargaining, not less and less plea bargaining. You know, the public constantly cries about excessive plea bargaining and blames the courts for it. Well, the courts do not want to plea bargain. The courts want to stop plea bargaining.
What is plea bargaining?
Well, plea bargaining is in criminal cases if a defendant is indicted, for example, for robbery in the first degree. That's robbery committed with a weapon, say with a gun. The district attorney might consent to a plea to a lower crime, robbery in the second degree, as though the defendant had not had a gun during the commission of the robbery. The reason for that might be that the courts are overcrowded. It might be, and it frequently is, that there are weaknesses in the case. But 88% of the indictments of the felony level cases in New York these days are plea bargained, or end as a result of a plea. 88% of the cases, and only about 4 or 5% of them are tried. That's not what should happen, but if the courts don't have the resources they need, that's what is going to happen. That's unavoidable.
How does the victim feel? The person who has been robbed or mugged, when a case like this is plea bargained, and it's plea bargained to where he doesn't have a gun, but the victim certainly knows he was bashed on the head with one.
Well, the victim feels even further demeaned. I mean, the victim feels from the crime itself, feels as though his person or her person has been invaded. They feel violated. Then they get into the criminal justice system and they see that the importance, the value of the event that happened to them, that's so personal for them, so important for them, is somehow discounted. It's reduced in importance when it gets into the court system. They blame the courts, but the courts are not at fault. Let me explain why. In the criminal court in New York City last year, there were over 500,000 cases filed. 80 judges were available to handle those cases. They had to handle 6,400 cases apiece. They had 225 days in the year, working days, to handle those cases. If each of them had tried one case a day, every single day for the whole year, they still would have had over 6,100 cases left to go. That's why there's plea bargaining. That's why there's always will be plea bargaining. If you have more judges and more resources, there's less plea bargaining.
But as a citizen of the city here, it's almost like things are getting out of control. For a time there, it was almost on a weekly basis that you'd pick up the newspaper and read about somebody else who was not involved in a crime, who was not involved in a robbery, who was walking down the street or getting a cup of coffee outside of the Bronx courthouse, who was shot and killed.
Yeah, I agree that there does seem to be more random violence now than there used to be. I was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan for 10 years until the mid-1980s, and I think things are worse now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. I think that is going to get worse. I don't think it's going to get better. And I'll tell you the reason is that there is a different attitude on the streets now than there was 15 years ago. There's a greater acceptance of violence. There's a greater acceptance of drugs and the profit motive, even among young children. The effects of the drug crisis on young children have been devastating. It's only getting worse. It's not getting better. And we have been taking every opportunity we have to say that. People need to understand it isn't getting better. It's getting worse.
But the public is looking towards you.
Well,
you're the court administrator. You're the court administration. Help us. Do something to
the first thing I do to help the public is to tell them the truth. I don't sugarcoat what's happening in the court system or in the justice system. I don't go around telling people that, well, it's really not as bad as it appears and so forth. It is as bad as it appears. In fact, it's worse than it appears to most people. What I need to do is to get the public to understand what really will solve this problem. Now, ultimately, there is no magic bullet that will solve this problem. Ultimately, resources are what are necessary. Now, that costs money. And I understand it's easy for me to sit here and say, give us more money and we'll solve the problem. All I'm saying is give us more money so that we can prevent the problem from getting a lot worse than it already is. It is a very simple equation. Judges are human beings. They can handle only a certain number of cases in a certain amount of time. And if there are more cases, a lot more cases, and you don't have a lot more judges, then they have to do something to dispose of those cases.
It seems almost that we have to get to a crisis situation before the legislature will start giving more money to the court system to alleviate a problem that very well may not be controllable then.
That's exactly right. I mean, we are at a crisis situation. We've been in a crisis situation for several years. The legislature has helped us out to some extent. This year they gave us 32 more judges around the state. I asked for 45. They gave us 32. It isn't enough. I mean, they are going to have to give us more. They are going to have to understand that in times of fiscal crisis like this, if you have to strip the government down, you strip it down to basics. You strip it down to essentials. The real reason that government exists, and the first reason that government exists, is to protect people so that the people can go about all of the rest of their lives. You don't strip down the very essence of government. And that's what's been happening now, and that's what we have to stop.
I read one article where Judge Wackler is trying to have, especially with repeat offenders, special courts, special judges. Can you discuss that?
Yes, we have had some difficulty because of the volume of cases in certain categories of cases. Homicides, that's murder cases. Gun cases, that's somebody just possesses a loaded gun. And in certain offenses that are called violent felony offenses, they're specifically designated crimes that carry a higher sentence, a longer sentence. In certain places, with respect to those crimes, the cases have tended to back up more. The reason, very simply, is that the defendants in those cases have a lot more at stake. They stand to go to jail or go to prison for a longer period of time. Therefore, they don't plead guilty as readily for obvious reasons. So those cases tend to back up. Now, we have created special courts in certain boroughs in order to try to move those cases along to trial more quickly, to pay special attention to them, to put specially designated judges in charge of handling those cases. But again, that is a method that we use, and it's one of several methods that we use, simply to move cases faster. Now, that isn't what we should be doing in an ideal world, and we know that. But we have an obligation to move those cases faster, because if we don't, there's no justice in any of the cases out there.
Let's talk about moving cases faster. In that very chair a couple of weeks ago, we had the chief of the New York City Police Department, who was ahead of getting the time from arrest to arraignment narrowed. That's what his job was. And although he said he was under a mandate to get somebody there within 24 hours, he said he never makes it. He can't make it almost in any county, perhaps in Staten Island, he said, because it takes between 48 and 50 hours just to do the process with the resources he has available.
Well, they are trying in the police department. I think that as an institution, the police department could try a little harder. I think that they might be able to put more resources to the problem. People need to understand that although it appears to be a very simple problem, you arrest someone, you book someone, you bring them to court, it is far more complicated than that, especially under the existing circumstances in New York City. For example, in Brooklyn right now, large borough, the criminal court is in downtown Brooklyn, but there are precincts all over Brooklyn, which is geographically a fairly large area. Someone is arrested, say, in Coney Island for a crime. They have to be brought to central booking in Brooklyn, which is also in downtown Brooklyn, where they're fingerprinted and photographed, and their fingerprints are then sent by fax machine to a state agency in Albany called the Division of Criminal Justice Services, which has all the fingerprints on record. Somebody there has to physically compare the fingerprint to certain characteristics and then run through a computer. Now, that obviously takes time. You have to do that to be sure you're dealing with the right person, to see what criminal record that person has. Then that person is one of hundreds, literally. There are 1,000 people a day arrested in New York City.
That's just the city?
That's just the city.
Without including Buffalo and Syracuse and
Without
Rochester.
including anything, just New York City, just New York City. Now, those cases start to back up. People like that person arrested in Coney Island start to back up. The detention cells in central booking overflow. The police then have to move those people out of central booking. So what they do is they take them back to the precincts. But now he may be in Coney Island, or he may be in Bensonhurst, he may be, someplace else in Brooklyn, sitting in a precinct, waiting to come down to court. But they wait until all of the people at the precinct that person is sent to are ready to go to court.
I see. And then they bring everybody.
Them down. So all the paperwork for all of those people has to be completed before they'll send a bus to bring them all down. Now, that is what causes the delay.
We have to take a break now, but I'd like to ask one question before the break, which I'd like you to think about. Many of the judges we've had on the show complain that they're ready and willing and able to start at 9:30 in the morning, yet the defendants don't get there till 10 or 10:30 or at 11. You're watching Lawline. I'm Alan Schnorman. Stay with us.
Every year, thousands of babies die from choking, suffocating, or other breathing emergencies. Just imagine how many of them could be saved if only they came with instructions. Please learn American Red Cross Infant and Child CPR. American Red Cross. We help you help others.
I was going to take a job with an engineering firm in New York. I got a better offer. I'm building schools overseas with the Peace Corps. The pace is a little slower than New York, but here I'm getting grassroots experience I couldn't get anywhere else. The way I look at it, the world can wait 2 years for another 40-story smoked glass high-rise.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
See you later, Carol.
I don't know if you'll remember me, but I'll never forget you. I'm Mr. Signorelli's daughter. I didn't think about what would happen if he went into cardiac arrest. I didn't realize that at 6 a.m., a nurse would call the shots and save his life.
If you have the smarts and the guts to study biology, chemistry, anatomy, and psychology, call 1-800-962-NURSE. If caring were enough, anyone could be a nurse.
Hello, I'm Alan Schnorman. Today's topic is the New York State court system. We're honored to have Matthew Crossan, the chief administrator of the court system. Right before the break, Matt, I had asked you, how come a lot of judges are ready at 9:30 and the defendants who are incarcerated don't get there till 10:30, 11 in many instances?
Well, I'll tell you, that's a mystery. In New York City, it happens frequently, although I know that the corrections officials are doing their best to deal with it. From what I understand, the corrections officials, say on Rikers Island, literally get an inmate up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to prepare him or her to come into court by 9:30. And yet, frequently, they're not able to do it. They're not able to get them there. Now they run into the kinds of problems that you would expect anybody who drives around New York City would expect. There'll be traffic jams on the BQE or something, but it is a systemic problem. It's a problem in every borough in New York City. It's a problem we are constantly meeting with corrections officials on. And exactly what we can do to solve it, or exactly what corrections can do to solve it, because it is, after all, their problem, is still something of a mystery to us. Now, I know they're trying, and I don't mean to minimize the efforts that they're making, but it is a very serious problem for the administration of justice in New York City. I know that the administrative judges on the criminal side in New York City single that out as the biggest single problem that the judges in criminal cases have, because they're constantly waiting for the delivery of prisoners. Obviously, the case can't be called in court until the defendant, the prisoner, is delivered by the correction department. And then, of course, what happens is that the lawyer will arrive, and the defendant will not have been delivered by correction, so the lawyer goes someplace else to do another case, then the defendant comes in, and by the time you get everybody together in the same place at the same time, half a day has been lost.
Sounds like a chaotic situation.
It is a very chaotic situation. You've got different agencies, different jurisdictions, different sovereignties. New York City is a different sovereignty from the state court system. The state court system is a branch of state government. The district attorneys are independently elected officials. The Legal Aid Society is an independent, separate corporation. All different organizations, all separate, all separately sovereign. You have to get them all to work together perfectly in coordination. Now, considering all of that, they work fairly well together when you take into account the fact that there are about 55,000 indictments handled and 500,000 other cases handled in New York City every year. And the courts manage to handle those cases, although not in the fashion that we would like and the public would like. Still, it is remarkable that as much gets done as does.
Matt, it seems like you're just barely getting by now with what you have. The mayor has proposed 5,000 new police officers. Of course, there are going to be more arrests because of these police officers. The streets are going to be safer. What's going to happen when they come into the court system?
Well, unless we have more resources, it will be close to a disaster. And we've said that publicly. I've said it many times. We've talked to the mayor about it. The mayor's proposal estimates that each new police officer will make 8 arrests a year. 8 a year. We think that that's probably on the low side, that police officers are likely to make more arrests a year apiece. But even if they make 8 arrests a year, that's going to result in something on the order of 50,000 more cases that the courts will have to handle. 50,000 more cases, even if their low estimate is accurate. Unless we have more judges to handle those cases, then what is now a chaotic situation will be a catastrophic situation. There's no way out of it. We are at the point of disaster now. That will tip us over the edge. The legislature simply will have to provide the additional judges and court personnel to deal with those additional arrests. And New York City will have to provide the courtrooms for those judges to sit in, because that's the city's responsibility, not the state's. If the judges don't have adequate courtrooms to sit in that have prisoner detention spaces and so forth, they can't work.
Of course, it takes years to build these courtrooms. You just don't call up and say, give me a courtroom.
Well, it does. I mean, one of the problems that we have now is that our criminal courts are filled almost to the breaking point. There are still some things that we can do within existing criminal court buildings, but we're very close to the edge. The fact is that you can't put more police officers on the street. I agree that more police officers are needed, but you can't put them on the street without adequately preparing for what will happen once they're on the street. There's another point here, because if you want police officers on the street to act as a deterrent, then that police officer walking the beat has to have credibility. The people who see him walking the beat have to know that the system behind him will back up the arrests that he makes. And if they know that the system will not back up the arrests that he makes, then that cop on the beat has no credibility in the neighborhood that he's patrolling.
You know, it seems like a circle. Yourself, you're the chief administrator of the court system. Everybody looks to you. You in turn say, I understand the problem, I recognize the problem. You look to the legislature. The legislature says, yes, I agree with him. Everything the man says is absolutely true, except what do you want us to do? We have to divide our budget amongst so many needy causes. The interest expense on our bonds must be paid. That's part of our good faith and credit of our state. We have to, the welfare has to be paid. All these avenues, and our revenues are dwindling. So we have all the public officials saying, we recognize the problem, but we don't have the resources, and the federal government is not helping us.
Ultimately, I think the legislature has to make choices. I think that they are resisting making choices. Ultimately, they have to set priorities and say that there are certain functions of government that we will not diminish, we will build up. Certain basic functions of government. There is no more basic function of government than the administration of justice. That means that certain things that are less basic will have to be defunded. They'll have to take the money away from certain things that are less basic. Now, nobody wants to have to make that choice. But ultimately, if the money keeps shrinking, if the revenues keep shrinking, those choices are going to have to be made, because we are teetering on the edge of disaster right now in the administration of justice, and it won't take much to push us over.
They haven't done it so far. What's going to happen to make them do it?
Well, I wish I knew that. I'm not sure that friendly persuasion is going to help them do it. As you say, it hasn't happened so far. I can tell you that all of the persuasive ability that Chief Judge Wackler and I have, and the judges in the court system, the administrative judges and the trial judges, is being bent to the task of persuading them just how bad things are. I can't report that we've made a lot of progress.
It's certainly not because of judges' salaries. We have one report here that some first-year associates at major law firms are making more than judges.
Absolutely. The average salary of a judge in New York State right now is $84,000. A little over that. There are judges of the Supreme Court who make $95,000, and there are judges of the city courts in New York State who make about $74,000. Right now, the starting pay of many lawyers fresh out of law school in New York City exceeds the pay to the average judge in New York State.
How do you attract quality people?
It's very difficult, and it's becoming more difficult. The judges in New York have been without a pay raise for 3 years. During that time, the non-judicial employees in the state and 200,000 employees in the executive branch have gotten raises that exceed 16%. 16%, so they're catching up to the judges. Also during that time, employees in the executive branch, 5,500 employees in the executive branch who earned more than judges of the city courts, about 3,000 who earned more than the average judge in New York State, got a raise. Last year, they got a raise of 5.5%, and judges were denied raises of what would have amounted to 5%.
Are you seeing quality judges leaving the bench because of financial problems?
We're about to see that, I think. There are more judges these days on the bench who are younger, who have children who are of college age, and it is very simply becoming difficult for them. They know that out in the legal marketplace, in law firms, they could be earning 2 or 3 times what they're earning on the bench. And we simply can't reasonably expect them to continue to do this. Public service is not meant to be a penalty. Public service is a sacrifice, but it is not meant to be a penalty.
Now, I know you favor the community court system. Can you discuss that with us?
Well, the idea of community courts is a simple one and really not a new one. New York City, the New York City Police Department, headed by Commissioner Lee Brown, has embarked on a policy of community policing, which is very similar to the old cop on the beat idea. The idea is to put take police officers out of the patrol car, put them back on the beat so they get to know the neighborhood, so they get to know the people, so they can solve problems rather than just respond to crimes that have been committed. Our idea is that the one thing that we need to complement that is having courts on the precinct level, on the local level, to deal with quality of life crimes, lower level crimes. Crimes like graffiti and noise-making, harassment, loitering, breaking windows, things of that kind. The kinds of crime and offenses that give people in each neighborhood the sense that there is no order, that there is a sense of disorder in the neighborhood, that anything goes and anything happens.
I'm feeling that in my own neighborhood here in the city. There are homeless people that have stationed themselves permanently in front of different retail stores. There's one homeless person who, his particular beat, I guess, is the Citibank. And he opens the door for anybody who goes into Citibank, and of course everybody gives him a quarter.
Yeah, I've seen that. And you can, and if you're homeless and living on the streets, especially in cold weather like this, you can understand why people do that. I don't think anybody wants to put homeless people in jail, but community policing is a way to help deal with the homeless problem. The cop on the beat can be clued into solutions to the problem of homelessness, can get to know some of those homeless people. But the problem that we have in New York is that over the years, we have spent so much attention on more serious crimes, predatory crimes, robbery, rape, assault, burglary, homicide. We have spent so much of our energy and so much of our attention on those crimes that we have allowed our attention to lower-level crimes to erode over the years. We don't pay enough attention to lower-level crimes. The result is a sense of disorder, and in that atmosphere of disorder, the more serious crimes breed.
Matt Crossan, thank you very much for appearing on Lawline, and sorry it was so short.
I'm glad to be here, Alan.
And as always, this is Alan Schnorman, and thank you for watching Lawline.
You have been watching Lawline with your host, New York trial attorney, author and lecturer, Alan Schnorman. Mr. Schnorman will be back with you next week at the same time. If you have any questions or comments about this week's program, please write to Lawline, 27th floor, 63 Wall Street, New York, New York, 10005.